here with the book of Esther, and tonight I got to thinking a little bit about directors for movies. I like historical movies. I've seen a lot of war movies, a lot that have really paid a great homage to historical things, and most of the time you get the big actors in these movies. They get paid the big bucks, the big dollar, to have some of the individuals come in, and understandably so, that because they want people to show up to see the movie. And there's got to be money that's met. There's got to be bills that have got to be paid. So it's very evident. However, most of the time, we often forget about an important person that is a part of the movie or the director. We don't always see the director and what they're doing. Obviously, if you hear about a movie, you may hear of a director's name. Oftentimes when you think about movies and the greatest probably filmmakers of all time that's made a lot of money is Steven Spielberg. I mean, one movie that I enjoyed watching when I was growing up, when I was a kid, was E.T. I thought E.T. was just the coolest little movie. But when you think about movies like that, you don't really hear the name that often. You do some, but without him doing and writing this and having everybody in place, it wouldn't have made what it actually made. And when we think about the story of our life, and we think about the story of what we're talking about here with the book of Esther and everything that's taken place, yes, there are important players. Yes, there are important factors that take place historically. You've got your key players that are in this story, Esther, Mordecai. We know these people and how important that they are. However, behind the scenes, working in sovereignty is a holy God. And yes, we don't see the name there in the pages. But like one of those quotes said that I've mentioned over the last couple of weeks, God's name may not be here, but His finger is on this story. He is very much evident in this story because of everything that takes place. And in Esther chapter number 2, we'll be looking at these verses here tonight. We'll read them all here at the beginning, but we're going to cover them as we go through this study tonight. But in Esther chapter 2, we see God, the unseen director of the story, working in each member's life to orchestrate events for the good of His people, and that we are reminded that just as He had not forgotten the Jews in Shushan, He has not forgotten us, and we touched on that over the last couple weeks as well, because it would have been very easy to think, God, you've forgotten about us, but He hadn't forgotten. It was all in His timing and all in His plan of how all this was going to work out. And so from Esther, we learned that ordinary days can become extraordinary. And God did this with Esther as He directed her steps. Now, I really like this quote. This is by F.B. Meyer. It says, "Fit yourself for God's service. Be faithful. He will presently appoint thee in some unlikely quarter in a shepherd's hut or in an artisan's cottage. God has His prepared and appointed instrument. As yet the shaft is hidden in His quiver, in the shadows of His hand, but at the precise moment on which it will tell with the greatest effect, it will be produced and launched on the air." So regardless of what your story is, regardless of the circumstances, regardless if you're in a location that has no people really whatsoever, a small town. Now, there's some small towns in the United States of America. I know there's at least a couple that have a population probably a couple hundred people. That's small. I mean, thinking about even with Kingston, thinking about Knoxville, all these surrounding areas, that's very small. But even in those remote of locations, God still is working out His purpose in your life for that place that you're at. So very instrumental, very important as we look at all this. And God is never surprised by anything happening in our lives. We should never think that. Now, we might be surprised. There's things that have popped up in my life that I have thought, why in the world, or how in the world did this happen, or why is this happening? But nothing ever surprises a holy God. With all that being said, let's look at our current situation that we're reading about here within the text. So first of all, we're going to deal with a defeated king. Now, look at the first three words of verse number 1 of the text. We'll read this here in chapter number 2, verse number 1. And these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now, three important words here. After these things. Now, between chapter 1 and chapter number 2, it is likely that there was a 3-year gap that had taken place. Now, why is that? Because King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, whatever you want to refer to him as, he had been at war with the Grecians. So there was a period of 3 years here, and he has now returned to Shushan, the place in defeat. Now, this guy that thought he had it all, he thought that he could not be touched, he has actually returned defeated. But it wasn't just a simple little defeat, it was a difficult defeat. Now, Xerxes, Ahasuerus' campaign against Greece began in victory at the Battle of Thermopylae. And then as he defeated and burnt Athens to the ground, but his success did not last as he was soundly defeated by the Greek navy in the Straits of Salamis. So he was thinking, hey, I've got this, but then he was beaten pretty soundly. Sort of like on a Friday night on a high school football game, you got a team that just thumps another one. We went to a game at York when we were with Kendra's family a couple of weeks ago, and at halftime, it was like already 50-something to nothing. And after a point when the second half begins, they just run the clock. There's no stoppage of incomplete passes. There's no stoppage for anything. The clock continuously runs. And they're doing that because they know that it's pretty much a mismatch. But here we see that he was soundly defeated by the Greek navy in the Straits of Salamis. And it was with this background of humiliation. Now, can you imagine? He's got this pride about himself. Oh, he's a prideful individual. He thought that, oh, I am pretty much just a person that cannot be touched. No one can go against me. It was with this background of humiliation that the great King Xerxes returned to Shushan, discouraged, and very likely he was fearful of how the provincial governors would respond to his loss. He's wondering this. So that's what it tells us here in verse number 1. Read that again here. And these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now, feeling badly about the failed Greek campaign. Now, remember we talked about this before. Remember when he had all these people come to his house? Oh, and it looked good. I'm telling you what. King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, he had everything. He had the banners. He had everything out. He put his best foot forward for all these people to come. Why is that? Many believe it was to draw them in, to entice them of going to war with Greece. Big mistake on his behalf. Big mistake. But after feeling bad about this Greek campaign, he also was angry. When he was angry against Vashti, perhaps he was having second thoughts about what he had done by banishing Queen Vashti. Now remember how bad that was? Now he was a king that thought he could have it anyway. And remember we talked about how that they made objects of women. More than likely, many Bible commentators believe that not only did he request her to come dance before these leaders. But more than likely, he wanted her to dance in the nude. And that's why many believe that she was so bold about saying no. And you just don't say no to the guy that thinks he can get it all. So, here we have this, that he's feeling bad about the failed Greek campaign, and is also his anger against Vashti, and he was maybe having second thoughts. We think about this as well. However, it is brought out in the account of Daniel in the lion's den. Now, this is chapter number 6 of the book of Daniel, that once a decree was made in the Persian law. The Persian law was a law that once a decree was made, it could not be changed. So once that decree was done, you couldn't take it back. Even by the king who initially decreed it. So Ahasuerus had banned Vashti in this way, and even though he was sad, maybe he regretted it, there was nothing he could do. He could not just reclaim that. He couldn't just say, no, I didn't mean to do that. He couldn't get her back. Now look what it says here in Esther 1, verse number 19. This tells us a little bit about this. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. It cannot be altered. So what is done is done. Proverbs 14, verse number 29 says this: He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. His anger and quick words with Vashti brought sorrow and regret later. And I got to thinking about that. And we're often reminded how we often regret decisions that we make out of anger. You ever made one just hastily because you're mad? Oh, I have. I've had to eat crow before. Crow's hard to swallow. Very hard. And the thing is, when you make a mistake out of anger, you can't take that back. You can't take back things that you've said. You can't take back things that you do. The only thing that you can pray for is that whoever you said that to or whoever you did something to, that they'll forgive you. That's all you can ask. That's all you can do. But oftentimes in anger, we are so quick to say things that we don't, that we later might regret. Also here, not only do we see a difficult defeat, but also a devised plan. So here is the defeated king remembering what he had done to Vashti and realizing that he needs a plan for getting a new wife. He said, okay, I've made this big, huge boo-boo, this big, huge mistake, and now I've got to get me a new wife. So he once again does something that is incorrect. He goes to these ungodly counselors. The same counselors who banished Vashti devise a plan to find her replacement. The plan was not a good one, and we know without a shadow of a doubt that they did not seek the Lord in what they were trying to do. Now remember, even though he is acting in the wrong, they're acting in the wrong. We got a big mess here with a very ungodly culture here. God is still working behind the scenes, being the director of this drama and this story. He is. Now these prideful men devised a plan to collect young women of the kingdom and bring them to a harem for the king's pleasure and choose them. Now remember, we talked about this last week, a harem. There may have been, who knows how many women would have been in this harem for the king's choosing. Now look what it says here in verses 2 and 3. Then said the king's servants that minister unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto
Shushan, the palace, to the house of the women under the custody of Hege, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. Now, the only qualification for these women was that they be what? Fair. Now, the Hebrew word is for hair is tobe, which means good, pleasant, agreeable, that is pleasant, agreeable to the senses. Now, what is obvious from this single qualification is that there was no concern for the woman's character. Did you catch that? The king's counselors only cared about what? Outward beauty. Why would that have been? Because they were thinking to themselves, a king that we know is who that he is and does what he does, he wants a smoking hot, beautiful. He wants someone that's going to look good to the eye. That's what our king, that's what he desires. And so these men searched the entire kingdom in all 120 provinces looking for these women. Now, can you imagine as they have sent the decree and they're going out through all these provinces looking for these women, how parents felt when their children, their teenage possibly, their young daughters would have to go. I mean, there was really no choice. Now, one commentator said this, that he believes that many parents may have tried to rush their daughters into marriage to get them out of this scenario. Very possible, very likely, could have been. We're not 100% sure, but that could have been a very important thing that could have happened. As we think about the fear of the parents. Now, once the women were selected, they were put through a process of physical purification. Okay? Look what it says here in verse number 4. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Then verse number 12. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purification of the women. Now, a couple things here. The purification process was degrading. It was perverse. Just getting down to where the rubber meets the road, he was trying them out for a one-night stand. That's what was happening here in this story. It's very evident. Each woman would spend one night with the king. If the king liked her, liked what she had to offer, thought that she was what he wanted, she would be sent to the harem to be one of the women available at any time for his call. Sad. Very sad. Objectifying women, putting something over them, just treating them as objects is what is seen here within this story. And this is the backdrop against which God, the unseen great director, was preparing the next cast members of this drama. This is sad. This is almost times looks dark. But even in the darkest of situations, God's still at work. It's hard to see. Now, another commentator wrote this, that the 12 months, why they were there through the purification process, was to make for certain that the women that were selected were not pregnant with a child. So that was another reason for the purification process. So there was a lot that went into this on trying to get a woman to come and be the next queen. So let's look secondly here, a promoted orphan. Now, God directed a defeated, prideful king to promote a humble, orphan Jewish girl. And here we are introduced to two cast members who will play important roles in the drama here within this story. So first of all, we look at Mordecai in the palace. Now, Mordecai had been carried from Jerusalem and brought into captivity many, many years earlier. Look what it says here in Esther 2, 5 through 6. Now in Shushan, the place, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with a captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonian, had carried away. Now, Mordecai would have been very well aware. He would have been very much acquainted with hardship. He knew what it was like to be a foreigner and also to be a captive. He would have been very much aware of this circumstance and what was going on. He must have been, many believe, to have been possibly around the age of 70 years old. And he is introduced in Esther as a certain Jew. This title could mean that those around him considered his heritage that he had to be a distinct feature. That's what many believe this could have meant. Mordecai was a descendant of King Saul in the line of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, in addition to Mordecai's heritage, he held an actual position of leadership as he sat in the king's gate. Now, this is going to be important here, okay? So you have to catch these important stories here within this huge story. Listen to what it says here in verse 19 and verse 21. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. And then verse 21, in those days while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. Now, let's look here also at this next part, Esther and the family. Now, Mordecai had adopted his young cousin after her parents had deceased and had passed away. We don't know what happened to them, that they were deceased, and he had taken them on. Comes from Esther 2, verse number 7. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, her uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now, when I hear this verse, and it says, and the maid was fair and beautiful, that means to tell me Esther must have been just drop-dead gorgeous. She must have been a very beautiful young lady. To actually say fair and beautiful, that's an important series of words there we see within the context of that verse. But when Esther was an orphan, Mordecai lovingly took her in as his own. This is a beautiful picture, I believe, also of what Christ did for us when he made us his own. Reminded of Romans 8, 15 through 16. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but we have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. I'm so thankful tonight that we are adopted into the family of God through Jesus Christ, our Lord. What a beautiful picture there. All right. But Mordecai had no way of knowing how God would promote this young girl. He didn't have a clue about how this story was going to end up. He had no idea. He simply loved and showed that he cared for her by the way he told her that. He showed her that. He cared for her. He literally set himself in the position of being her earthly parent. He cared for her. Also, we see the next part of this is when Esther was brought to the palace. Now, as the king's messengers brought these beautiful young women they had gathered, Esther was one of them. Look what it says here in verse number 8. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decrees was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan, the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. Now, the historian Josephus tells us that there were 400 women more than likely brought to this palace. Now, I don't know about you, but 400 young women in the same place, there were a lot of chitter chatter probably going around. Some of them, I don't know, some of them may be hoping I could be the queen. I don't know, I wasn't there. But here we see that the historian Josephus believes that that was likely. The word brought in Esther 2:8 is another reminder that Esther was forcibly compelled and placed in the custody of Haggai. Most likely it was against her will. And this would have not been either Esther or Mordecai's plan. So first of all, we see here she was immediately favored. Now, in God's sovereignty, Esther was instantly shown favor by Haggai, the keeper of the women. Look what it says here in verse number 9. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification. This is only God's sovereignty working all this out. I mean, with all these women, for all this going on, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. But isn't it God who gives us favor with others? I'm reminded of another time that is shown early in the Babylonian captivity with Daniel. Daniel 1, verse number 9, where favor was shown. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. So God shows His favor. He works out in situations that seem bleak, and this is seen here as well with this story of Esther. But not only was she immediately favored, but she did not reveal her ancestry. Now, before taken to the place, Mordecai warned her not to reveal what? That she was a Jew. He said, don't do that. Look what it says here in verse number 10. Esther had not shown her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. He was really clear. He said, don't show, don't say about your ancestry, who that you are. Now, Esther's Hebrew name was Hadassah, but throughout this story, she goes by her Persian name, Esther. Now, Mordecai's warning to Esther seems to emphasize the reality of anti-Semitism in Persia. This would have been very common. This would have been a very interesting thing during this time. Even as it is present at many places of the world today, anti-Semitism is shown. Now, some readers of Esther today sometimes question the intensity. Now, I have this here for you, so I'm going to read it to you. You can follow along with me. Some readers of Esther today sometimes question the intensity of Mordecai and Esther's faith because of Esther hiding her Jewish identity. Some criticize them for Esther not revealing her nationality. She should have. Some would say that. Furthermore, some question why Mordecai and Esther were still living in Shushan when many of the Jews had returned to Jerusalem. Were they too comfortable in their Persian lifestyle to return to Israel? Now, the book of Esther does not give us the answer to these questions at all. It is possible that Mordecai and Esther were violating some of God's laws in Persia. Could have very well been. And it is possible that they let fear overcome faith. Yet God still used them in His plan for the redemption of His people. This is key. God's people are not perfect, but God's purpose is perfect. And we see that evident every day. I get up and stand and I preach because that's God's calling on my life, but I'm far from perfect. I miss the mark every day. And I have to confess my sins to a holy God when I mess up, just like you do as well. You have to confess. None of us are perfect, but God's plan and purpose is. And I'm just so thankful that we can be pieces that He uses in the conjunction with His plan to make His purpose come to fruition. Example, Peter. I mean, how many times did Peter mess up? During Christ's great hour of need, he denied Christ 3 times. That he didn't even know who he was. But we see how Peter was used, how God used him, and how he was used in the church throughout history. God uses imperfect people. And I'm thankful for that today. Also, she waited 12 months. Once brought to the palace, Esther waited 12 months before she was presented to the king. Esther 2, verse number 12. Now, when every maid's turn was come to go into the king Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and the other things for the purifying, of the women. Now, some commentators suggest, and we mentioned this earlier, that they were held for 12 months to be sure they were not expecting a child. Many believe that to be the case. The Bible also mentions that this was a time of physical beautification and purification. So the purification with the beautification. What does this mean? Well, to get them ready for the king, they had to be powdered up. They had to get beautied up. Their hair, their face, whatever it is. And you think about today, what's some of the leading things today for women, and I guess for some men today? I don't know if men use the stuff, I don't want to get into that. But for like Avon, and you have Avon today, you have Mary Kate, I guess. What's some other ones? There's Mary Kate, there's Avon, and then there's some that people will sell on their own. And I know Avon because my mom, when she was alive, my aunt used to sell it, and I remember those little Avon bags going around all the time, and getting the lipstick, the rouge, all these nail polishes and stuff. But there's a lot of money that's spent today, and rightly so. A woman should look beautiful, and that's rightly so. And during this time, I believe that, and many commentators stated as well, that this was a time that they were just prettied up. And they were trying to find the king, the right one, okay, with all these women that were there. And sadly, it tells us here that Esther had to participate in this contest. She did. She had to spend her night with the king. She was made the queen. The Bible tells us in verses 13 through 14 that each maiden was called to go to the palace and spend a night with the king. And the process was a mockery to true marriage. Why is that? Because this culture that this was going on had no respect for a holy God. That was the problem. Why today is there people that live together and have no reservations, have no problem with what they're doing? It's because they don't honor what marriage is all about. They don't honor a holy God. Why is there couples living together of the same sex saying they're in a relationship? They don't honor it. And this right here was literally a mockery to true marriage. Sadly, it's unlike how many people live today. And sadly, Esther had to participate in this contest. Yet God granted her favor with the king, and she was not dismissed the next day, but was chosen to be the queen of Persia. Like I said, even in a situation that does not look good, God's still working in the background. And this is what we have here within the context of this story here. Look what it says here in Esther 2, verse 17 and 18. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she had obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, unto even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And it was from this position that God would use Esther to preserve the Jews. And this is what's really interesting about this story. All right, let's look thirdly here at a prominent Jew. Now, after Esther's coronation, after she is put into this position and the king has made her his queen, the narrator of the book shifts the spotlight to Mordecai as he sits in the king's gate. Now, we read about this briefly. We'll touch on it again. We see an interesting situation take place. A plot to assassinate the king. Now, while in the king's gate, Mordecai overhears a plot to assassinate the king. We'll read that again here, 21 and 22. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king was known to Mordecai, and the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it under Esther the queen, and the Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. Now, these men plotting this assassination were likely eunuchs, and the men forced into a life of servitude to the king. They were obviously angered and intended to harm the king. They did their jobs out of anger, they were upset, and they were mad, and they wanted to get revenge. So here's their plan. We're taking the king out. Now, the warning from Mordecai. Now, Mordecai did not have to do anything with the information that he heard. He didn't have to do anything with it. He could have just let them go. He could have let them do it, fulfill what they were trying to do. Who would have known if he had just walked away and not said a word about what they intended to do to the king? Possibly he could have done that, but he didn't. He chose not to do that. He immediately told Esther, who told the king. We see that in verse 22. Then verse number 23, let's read that. We'll go into verse 23. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore, if they were both hanged on a tree. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, speaking of being upset, Esther and Mordecai had good reasons to be angry with the king themselves. After all, this was the same king who had brought over 100 young women, including Esther, and placed them in a harem. They could have just let him die. This is a guy that's got all these women and just used them however he so chooses. We could just let this guy just die. And all we would have to say is nothing. And this could happen. But the thing is, when people are hurt, and we see this a lot today, is that when people are hurt and people have been deeply afflicted by others, the first thing that they want to do is give themselves over to what? Anger. How am I going to get them back? Oh, I've seen many people like that I've sat down and talked to, and they haven't said it with their mouth, but I've seen it in their eyes and I've seen it in their thing. It's like they've done me wrong, so I'm going to do them wrong, and that's going to set the record straight. Well, what's the old saying? 2 wrongs don't make a right. Romans 13:10 tells us, love worketh to no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. You know how the world sees that we're different as Christians? When people wrong us, they see that we forgive people, and that baffles the world. But you know what that tells the world also? That we love Jesus and we follow after what He's told us to do. But see, when we react out of anger, that does the testimony of our Lord no good, and it does our testimony no good. But when we choose to forgive, when we let things go, that's huge. It is confidence in God's sovereignty and goodness that allows us to leave justification in His hands. Look what it says here in Romans 12:19. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. It's not our place to extract vengeance. It's not our place to go back and get someone because they've hurt us. our place is to forgive, even when it's hard to do. I'm not saying it's easy. And I've preached sermons on this before about forgiveness. Sometimes it's really hard to forgive. Don't get me wrong. I've had some times where I've really just had to pray. Sometimes ask God, God, are you sure? And yes, we're to forgive, even in the hardest. I'll never forget one trial. There was a family who had their loved ones who had been murdered. I mean, brutally murdered by this individual. And I'll never forget, this has been a long time ago, but I remember one of the family members who was deeply hurt came up and forgave that person. Can you imagine how hard that would be? I don't know. I'd have to be in that person's shoes. I don't know what I would have done, to be honest. That'd be hard. But I remember hearing that story and thinking, if they could forgive someone for brutally murdering their family and forgive them, and we can't forgive someone for offending us for something really silly, what does that say? And you know what happens often in churches? I know it's getting off task just a little bit here, but often in churches, people will get offended by something that someone else has done, and you know what their first inkling is? I'm leaving. What does that do? Nothing. It does no good for nothing. What they should have done was talk it out, work it out. That brings honor to the Father. But when you go somewhere else and take that baggage with you, you've got unresolved spiritual things and you're taking it somewhere else. Get it taken care of where it's at. So that's another sermon in and of itself, but I just think it's important that we lead the things of God to the things of God. Let Him take care of those things that we have no power over. It is also worth mentioning here that while we should exhibit forgiveness and love for those who have wronged us, now this is important, this stuff I put down here, we have a civil responsibility to report illegal activity, okay? So that means that if someone comes to me in confidence and they need counsel and they tell me something that is illegal activity, I have to report that. I mean, you have to report that. Because if not, then you're going against the law, especially because the perpetrators might injure others. If someone comes and tells me they've got a problem with something and it looks like it's going to get worse, you've got to take care of the issue. You've got to nip it in the bud. Choosing not to be angry does not mean we should cover up illegal activity or sexual or physical abuse. Perhaps here, Mordecai reported these conspirators partly because he felt it was his civic duty. It's possible that that was the situation in the midst of all this with God's sovereignty, that he reported this as his civic duty. Now, after Esther told the king, Mordecai was not immediately recognized. In some ways, this incident seems out of place. When we hear about this in the chapter, we think, why this story? Why this now? Almost like a deviation from the main plot. However, it proves to be extremely important later in the book. Very important. God is still orchestrating events, and he had a position, Mordecai, exactly where Mordecai needed to be. I've heard this said before. God is going to place you exactly where he wants you to be. There's been times in my life that God has placed me exactly where I needed to be, and that was because he was using me in the situation that he had me in. Sometimes good deeds go unnoticed, but God sees all and will reward us in due time. See, we're not to seek the pleasure of people here upon this earth. Our reward is going to come one day from God. Now, people may applaud you, people may reward you here, but that should not be the reward we ultimately seek. It should be of God. 1 Corinthians 3:13 tells us, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. And I'll close tonight with that story. That's where we will stop at tonight. But that we see here within the context of what happened. So we've come to the place where Esther is now queen, and this has been reported. and we're going to get into more as we go on with this story. But I want to close with this. This may have been one of the first stories I told when I came here to the church, and I love it. A seminary professor told me this years ago, and it stuck with me. And this talks about rewards here upon this earth. There was a missionary couple once that had went and served for 25 years on the mission field, and they were coming home. This was during the time of Teddy Roosevelt being the President of the United States. And as they were traveling home, it wasn't by bus, it wasn't by plane, it was by ship. Little did they know that as they were coming back from their trip, Teddy Roosevelt was also aboard that ship. And as they came into the dock, they could not wait to see the home that they had so missed. They had seen a lot of people in 25 years. It had been a long time. But little they know, Teddy Roosevelt was on there. So as the ship came to dock, they saw a big crowd. And they got kind of a little excited because they had no idea Teddy was on the boat. They had no idea. And people started clapping and started just cheering. The husband got real excited. He looked at his wife and he said, "Honey, look, they're excited. We're home. 25 years on the mission field that we've served." Well, as they turned and looked, they saw that Teddy Roosevelt was on the boat also. And the crowd looked at him and cheered and said, "He's our president. Welcome home." And he came down after a long hunt. Well, the husband, as you can tell, he was sad. He looked at his wife and he just complained on the way home. He said, "Honey, 25 years and no one cheered for us." His wife was a little upset too. Her husband was deflated. They got back, and as you know, there's no big home for them when they come home. They had a little apartment, little one bedroom, little small apartment there. Came in. Oh, he was still upset. He was still hurt. And she said, "Honey, there's nothing I can do for you, but you just need to go talk and get this settled with the Lord." And I love this story. He went in and he started praying. He said, "God, 25 years. We worked for you 25 years. And we come home to this." He came back out to his wife and she said, "Well, what did the Lord tell you?" He about perked up. He said, "God told me that this isn't our home. Our home is yet to come." And that's just good. Because 25 years they had served, but we don't look for the applause here. We look for the applause and the reward of one day, for the reward of serving here. And I think that's a powerful story. Even in this story here, Mordecai, sometimes good deeds seem to go unnoticed, but God will give us our reward in due time. I really like that. I shared it here when I first came to church. I don't remember you sharing that story, but hopefully sometimes when I share stories, I hope you forget them. They'll lose their pungency, okay? Because sometimes I may share stuff over. I don't know. I can't remember everything that I say. But wow, what a great, great story. And I thought I'd close with that one tonight because that's so true. So true. Yeah. All right, anything I've said tonight that... Oh, okay. Anything that caught your attention tonight from this? Good question. I don't know. I would say I could almost imagine that Esther, this is only speculative here, but with her being a virgin, I could imagine that, and her being that young, teens, maybe early 20s, for sure. With her being adopted, I don't know how long that Mordecai raised her. The king, he could have been 30s, could have been 40s. I don't know. It's a good question. Yeah. Anything else that kind of caught your attention?
So, what else? Hopefully this has been interesting. Something they don't talk about a lot in this book. Yeah. Mm. Well, and also, if you remember the king's chamberlain, like he found favor. Remember that word favor I mentioned there? So there would have been more put into her than I think that would have been put into the others. And obviously, all the time, God's working behind the scenes to make all this work. At the same time, though, God's using these people to accomplish that purpose. So I think, like I mentioned, that one verse, fair and beautiful, that's unique wordage there. I think that Esther was a beautiful Jewish woman. And I think there was part of it where he found her very attractive, but also just that part of how God was using these people like the chamberlain. That all played in to this story of why that happened. Yeah, the Jewish descent, yeah. No, not in here. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen that movie. I think I mentioned, but One Night with the King. It's a Christian-based movie, and the guy they have chosen to play King Xerxes, every time he looks at her and talks to her, and it's just the guy that played the part. It's sort of like he looks at her, and it's like he's in Gaga, I guess, just with his eyes when he's looking at her. I'll never forget. It's been a long time since I've seen that movie, but it came out 2000 sometime. It's called One Night with the King. On the front, it has Esther on the front pushing the doors open as she goes into the king chamber, like where his rule is. So, you ever seen it? It's a good movie. It's pretty accurate, I think so. You know, something else I thought of too, and I'll close with this, is I was talking about that using people that are not perfect, that are flawed, is a good question to ask is, why didn't they go back to Jerusalem? I mean, what kept them there? Had they got comfortable? Yeah, well, God, obviously, but that's just something I'd never really thought about that until I got in and started reading this. Is why didn't they just go back? Why did they want to continue in living in this area? I mean, sometimes I like to ask those questions and kind of ponder on them, even though I may not ever have an answer. I mean, but yeah, it's of God. I mean, God worked it all out, but just interesting to kind of think that. All right. Well, thank y'all for being attentive tonight. Let's go ahead and let's stand and we'll pray.